the late 1970s, London was a city in transition. The streets were alive with music, pubs filled with laughter, and young men flocked to the capital searching for freedom, work, or simply a place to belong. But hidden behind the walls of ordinary flats, in quiet neighborhoods where neighbors nodded politely and buses rolled by without pause, something unspeakable was happening. It all came to light in February of 1983, when a blocked drain in a North London apartment building led workers to a horrifying discovery: human flesh and bones clogging the pipes. The police traced the plumbing back to one man, a former civil servant, a quiet, polite neighbor. His name was Dennis Nilsen, and what they uncovered inside his flat would shock Britain for decades. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born in 1945 in the remote fishing town of Fraserburgh, Scotland. His childhood was marked by loneliness, shyness, and an early sense of being different. His parents' marriage quickly fell apart, leaving Dennis adrift between a distant mother and an absent father. But the deepest scar came when he was just 6 years old. His grandfather, the one adult he felt closest to, died suddenly of a heart attack. Nilsen saw the body laid out in its coffin, pale and lifeless. For most children, the sight would be traumatic. For Dennis, it became a defining moment. He later described death as both horrifying and strangely comforting, something permanent that could never abandon him. As he grew older, Dennis remained isolated. He joined the army as a teenager, serving as a cook and later as a police officer. The roles gave him structure and discipline, but did little to ease his loneliness. He drank heavily, drifted through jobs, and never formed lasting relationships. To the outside world, he was unremarkable, but inside, something dark was forming, a belief that companionship could only be kept if it never left. And the dead, of course, could not walk away. By the late 1970s, Nilsen had moved to North London. He lived in a modest flat at 195 Melrose Avenue. It was there, in December of 1978, that his urges finally turned into action. He met a young man named Stephen Holmes after a night of drinking. They went back to Nilsen's flat, drank some more, and eventually fell asleep. But as morning approached, a familiar fear crept over Nilsen, the fear of being alone again. When Holmes stirred, Nilsen panicked. He grabbed a necktie, pulled it tight, and held it there until the young man was still. In his confession years later, Nilsen said he didn't want Holmes to leave. He wanted him to stay. In death, Holmes finally would. For the first time, Nilsen discovered what he believed was companionship without abandonment, and he was hooked. After killing, Nilsen didn't immediately dispose of the bodies. Instead, he kept them. He washed them, dressed them, sat them in chairs, even spoke to them as if they were still alive. At night, he would lie beside them, imagining they were his companions. Days might pass before the reality of decay set in. When it did, he would hide the remains under the floorboards of his flat. At times, he burned them in bonfires in the garden. Neighbors noticed the strange smell, but he explained it away as rubbish or cooking. No one suspected the truth. This became his pattern. Lure men back with the promise of food, drink, or shelter. Strangle or drown them. Then keep them close, at least for a little while. Over the next few years, the killings continued. Most victims were young men, often drifters, sometimes students, sometimes men living on the edge of society. Nilsen selected those who wouldn't easily be missed, the vulnerable, the forgotten. By 1981, the floorboards of Melrose Avenue were packed with bodies. The smell became unbearable, forcing Nilsen to move. He relocated to a smaller flat at 23 Cranley Gardens. But unlike the first home, this one had no garden to burn remains and no floorboards deep enough to hide them. So he found another way. He began cutting up the bodies, flushing pieces down the toilet, or boiling them on the stove to remove flesh from bone. He believed this would make disposal easier, but the plumbing told a different story. In February of 1983, tenants at Cranley Gardens began complaining of blocked drains and foul smells. When a plumber opened the pipes, he pulled out something that made his stomach turn. Chunks of human flesh, bones. The police were called. They traced the plumbing to the top floor flat. Dennis Nilsen opened the door calmly, as if nothing were wrong. But when detectives confronted him, he didn't run, didn't argue. Instead, he sighed and said, "It's a long story. More than 15, I suppose. I'll tell you everything." In custody, Nilsen spoke for hours, detailing his crimes with chilling calmness. He described the killings, the rituals, the way he kept the bodies for company. He admitted to attempting necrophilia, but often stopped, saying it wasn't truly about sex, it was about possession. One detective later said that Nilsen spoke as if he were describing someone else's life. Polite, articulate, almost apologetic, yet utterly detached from the horror of his words. Forensic teams recovered remains of at least 12 victims, but Nilsen claimed the true number was higher, possibly 15 or 16. Some victims were never identified. Dennis Nilsen's trial began in October 1983. It lasted 6 weeks and drew intense media attention. The British press dubbed him the kindly killer because of his calm demeanor, or sometimes the British Jeffrey Dahmer, though Dahmer's crimes came later. The courtroom was transfixed by Nilsen's testimony. He admitted to strangling his victims, often while drunk, and keeping their bodies for days, sometimes weeks. He claimed he killed out of loneliness, not malice. When asked why he did it, he gave a simple, haunting reply: "I couldn't stand the thought of them leaving me." The jury rejected any plea of diminished responsibility. He was found guilty of 6 murders and 2 attempted murders. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with a recommendation he never be released. In prison, Nilsen was an unusual inmate. He was well behaved, often kept to himself, and spent long hours writing in journals. He recorded his thoughts, memories, even detailed sketches of his crimes, but he never showed remorse. To some, he seemed reflective, almost philosophical. To others, he was manipulative, using words to maintain control even behind bars. He served his sentence quietly for decades. Occasionally, journalists sought interviews, hoping for answers. But Nilsen's explanations always circled back to the same idea. He killed because he was afraid of being alone. On May 12, 2018, Dennis Nilsen died in prison at the age of 72. The official cause was a blood clot following surgery. There were no mourners. No one claimed his body. He was cremated, and his ashes disposed of in secret. Just like that, the life of one of Britain's most notorious killers ended in silence. But for the families of his victims, and for a nation that had watched the trial in horror, the memory of his crimes remained. The case of Dennis Nilsen is not just about murder. It's about the hidden dangers of loneliness, obsession, and control. Nilsen wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. He was a neighbor, a man who waved politely, paid his rent, and worked an ordinary job. And yet, behind closed doors, he committed acts of unimaginable horror. Perhaps the most chilling part is that his victims were not chosen for who they were, but for what they weren't. They weren't connected. They weren't missed quickly. They slipped through society's cracks and into Nilsen's hands. Even now, decades later, his story raises questions we can't easily answer. Was Nilsen driven by madness, by a desperate need for company, or by something darker, an emptiness no one could ever fill? We may never know. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, because evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it lives in the flat upstairs, quiet, polite, smiling when you pass in the hallway, and you never realize until it's far too late. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime documentaries, and let me know in the comments, which case should we cover next?